Greetings all. Welcome to another session here of Tuesday Talks. Today we're going to be investigating a little bit more about second language acquisition and how how man learns. We're going to look a little bit at the history of learning processes and some of the ideas and concepts that have come out through the years, particularly since the 1940s and 50s. I'm going to begin by just asking the question, how does man learn? Or I guess the more politically correct way to say it would be, how do humans learn? How do we learn? What are the ways in which we learn? There are a number of theories that have come out, and we're going to start out with the more basic ones and move up to the higher order ones, or the more common ones from today. I do believe there are other modes of thinking, other modes of learning, primarily when we look at the ability to understand language. A lot of what we're going to be looking at today is more interested in how we learn from a non-linguistic point of view, at least initially. And let's just jump right off into conditioned response, which is Pavlov and his dogs. And I do believe you have studied that before, where you have a response, and even before the condition, the actual supposed condition begins, you have that type of response. Remember, him turning on the light caused it. So it was a conditioned response. A little later on, you had Skinner talk about operant conditioning, and he was less concerned about the response, but he was more concerned about the reaction of the response afterwards, which actually would reinforce the operant, the response. Similar type of idea where you have a condition and a response, but this one's a little more specialized because it's looking at the reinforcement of this action over and over again that makes it more memorable and more learnable. Following Skinner's theory, came out with Ausubel's subsumption theory. And the subsumption theory is basically to incorporate new information into the already existing structure. Basically what you're doing is you're adding information into the already existing database, as opposed to not having a database and then trying to create and develop one. So from Ausubel's perspective, this is the meaning of learning, when you're adding new information to already existing information. When you're somehow taking new information and putting it from a temporary memory, short-term memory, and putting it into longer-term memory. When information is subsumed into the learner's cognitive structure, it's organized hierarchically. And so that's how you put things into longer-term memory. Brown gives a very good description of the difference between real meaningful learning, which is what Ausubel is trying to show, versus rote learning. And rote learning, any of you who have ever pulled an all-nighter and you've tried to memorize certain things so that you could pass a test, and when you're done, it's gone, 2 days later, as opposed to something that's more meaningful. And those are things that you're going to remember longer because it has some sort of meaning to you. The other example that Brown gives is your phone number. It's an arbitrary set of 10 numbers, and it's not nearly as memorable as a street address, because a street address is invoking a meaning of a location and the meaning of possibly a floor, a city, so that there's more meaning there. It's going to be easier to remember. As I was looking at this, though, I started thinking, wait a minute, what about Chinese characters? Japanese and Chinese and Taiwanese and everyone who has to study Chinese characters spend an unbelievable amount of time studying these characters, memorizing these characters. And the way that they do it is they write them 100 times so that they can remember how to do them. Now, there are other meaningful components that you can do with them, but it's basically rote. They do it over and over and over and over and over again until it gets pushed into their long-term memory. Now, it's not the same as pulling an all-nighter, but it is rote memory. In fact, it's one of the reasons why educators from the West who travel to the East complain about Asian students, because they don't, quote unquote, they don't think, they just memorize, because that's what they grew up with. You and I, if we're from the West, we learn our alphabet when we're about 6, or thereabouts. Asian students who are learning Chinese characters, when they're growing up, they continue learning until high school, till they're done with high school. There's so many different characters they have to learn. I know that in Japanese it's almost 2,000 characters. In Chinese language, it's even more. And so that's rote learning. What's wrong with that? And so when I came to this point, I'm like, well, hold on a minute. I mean, we do have this whole rote system that can be useful. It can put things into longer-term memory. Obviously, there are going to be some other things going on there, but I don't know that I see this big distinction here between rote learning being the weaker of the two and meaningful learning being better. There is a place for it, although to be certain, something that's more meaningful is going to be easier to memorize. I did happen to go to school with a little girl, and she really frustrated me. One, because she was a straight A student, but two, I would ask her, we would be talking about a theory or something in a class, and I would say, well, what does this mean? Her answer would be, I don't know, I just memorize it. And that's how she did well in class. I couldn't, it was difficult for me to do that. So anyway, meaningful learning versus rote. Rote does have a place and can be useful. I don't think the difficulty is not in its benefit, but in keeping it up. Continue doing it. Lastly, I want to talk about a little bit of systematic forgetting. Your brain, which is kind of like the manager of the database in your head, does what they call systematic pruning, systematic forgetting. Things that you're not going to be using anymore, they stop using them. When your brain stops accessing a particular memory for a long period of time, well, then that memory begins to become less accessible, and things can get cut off. Now, it doesn't mean all things do. There are certain things, there are certain smells, there are certain sounds that once you hear, and memories come back. And so that might be a big thing there, but there are certain elements that are cut off. I had the opportunity to go visit the house that I grew up in when I lived in Illinois, maybe 20 years later. And I hadn't seen the house in all that time. And I go to the house and I walk in, and you become so emotional because things that you see and things that you touch bring back all these memories. Those memories weren't cut off, but they certainly were not used a long time. Some of them remain, some of them do get cut off. Anyway, there's just some of the ways that we learn. Here's a couple more. Roger's humanistic psychology. His studies were more focused not so much on the cognitive abilities, but he believed that learners will learn better when they have what Krashen would call a low affective filter. So they have to, quote unquote, be at peace with their feelings. In other words, having that low affective filter allows you to have more freedom, less frustration, less things blocking your ability to learn. So according to Rogers, the goal of education then should be the facilitation of learning. We're supposed to be facilitators, encourage people to learn. Now, I don't know exactly how he means that. Something tells me that this is more touchy-feely. Let's all be nice, let's all get along. But I also know that Grandpa also works. And you may have heard this story before where I was asking my foreign students how they learned language, which method that their teachers use. And some would say that it was the grammar translation method, and others were saying it was more like the Krashen method. And one student raises his hand and says, I did the Grandpa method. And I was kind of like, well, what do you mean, the Grandpa method? And he said, well, he grew up in Nepal, and until he was 6 years old, he spoke Nepali, and that was all. And he went to this school, and they only spoke English there. And the principal of the school had all these long, thin sticks, reeds. And if anybody was caught speaking any language other than English in the school, no matter where they were, lunch, cafeteria, break, in the hallway, they would get hit with a stick. And the biggest of all these sticks, he nicknamed Grandpa. Now, I have this foreign student in my class, and his English is very good. So I had to start laughing and say, oh, it's an effective means of learning, provided that you have the ability to use Grandpa. But this is definitely not a low affective filter if you know that Grandpa is around. But it did work because he's an example of it working. So the facilitation of learning, yes. Is that a low affective filter? I don't know. It certainly is probably one of the more usable options that we have, but it certainly isn't the only one. Learning how to learn is more important than being taught by a superior. This is also the same way as saying, give a man a fish and he'll eat for a day, teach a man to fish and he'll eat for a lifetime. And I would definitely agree that we need to teach students how to learn a language, other than and not merely teach them language. I think we need to do both, but more importantly, we need to get them to be independent learners. So, in the classroom, who should have control? Who has control? Brown is going to be talking a little bit about this, with the fact that teachers, should relinquish some of their quote-unquote control, so that students have more motivation, so that students have more of a desire to learn. And I would agree with that on the face of it. Okay, I remember years ago when a teacher was talking to us and he was saying, you have these little 3x5 cards and they got words on them, and you're playing a little game with them with the kids, and if a kid gets it right, and you say, okay, you can have that card, you hand that off to them. And then all of a sudden you say, okay, who wants to be the teacher and hold the cards, right? And the kids say, oh, I do, right? And you give him the cards, and then now the little kid's holding the cards, and he's handing them off to his fellow peers, and everybody's excited, right? Who's in charge? The teacher is still in charge. Now, the student may think he's in charge, the student may feel as if he's in charge, but the teacher is still in charge. The teacher has simply used a different format to allow students to learn. I look at this whole idea of control. It is the teacher who is going to be ultimately responsible. It is the teacher who can get sued or get fired, or is responsible for their children's safety. So this whole idea here of who has control, to me, is a simple answer. It is the teacher. How is that control used is now the more important question. And that's going to be, I'm going to try to find some way to get my kids to want to learn. And now we jump to the Huck Finn story, where we convince these kids that painting the fence, not Huck Finn, Tom Sawyer, painting the fence is fun. Painting the fence is good. We've got to convince these kids that learning language is good and fun and beneficial. And that may mean letting them hold the flashcards. That may mean letting them work in small groups. Okay? But still, control is still done by one person. So I would disagree with what Brown is saying here. Teachers should be facilitators, building relationships with their students. Yes, they can be facilitators. But more importantly, they should be ones that are using their control in such a way that they encourage their learners to want to learn. And that may mean giving up the role of a lecturer. That may mean doing other things, so allowing students to have more of a productive engagement in the classroom. That's the way I'm going to look at it. I'm not going to look at the issue of control. Control should always be with the teacher. But that doesn't mean the teacher's always doing things. The teacher can sit in a corner and just watch and observe as they're doing things. Right? I hope you see the difference. All right, Paolo Fieri. He did research on the pedagogy of the oppressed, and a lot of his work and research focused on the importance of empowerment. When I first learned about this guy and the work that he was doing, I was a little taken aback because I'd never thought that a teacher had power over the students. I began to realize we do. There are many places in the world, and you may be in a class, you may be a teacher in one of those classes, where you have power over your students. They have to be there. It's not their choice. Or they're forced to being there because of their parents. And you now have control and power over them. And how are you using this power? Okay? Are you using this power to force them to listen? Are you using this power to humiliate or intimidate or hold something over them? I don't know. You could be. You shouldn't be. And we can go off into a whole discussion on power there, and I would, of course, run to the concept of being getting the ideas of education and training and teaching from the master teacher, Jesus Christ. But I'm not going to go into that. Freire here is going to say that we're not supposed to be lording this power over our students' heads. At the same time, we're not supposed to be using it in order to develop or control the curriculum. We're supposed to negotiate with our students. What is it that they want to learn? What is it that they want to do? So we have more of a cooperative type of engagement with the students, and we kind of discover what they want to learn. Okay? Different focus now from what we've had in the past. Now, When I come to the classroom, I immediately want to do a needs analysis. What do my students need? What do my students want? What does the school want? What do other what's the word? What do other interested parties want when I'm going to be coming to the classroom? I want to be able to figure that out. Part of that is knowing what students want and need, right? I want it to be an open and cooperative process like that. I don't want it to be a defensive process where my students are afraid that they're not going to get a good grade. Okay? Because the goal is not getting a grade. The goal is doing well in your language growth. And I meet students who are concerned about every single point because they want to get a good grade. And I constantly try to tell them it's not about the grade. It's about learning. So you as a teacher want to create an environment that's more cooperative in nature. Okay? Now, we're going to go back to the issue just like in the last slide about control. Ultimately, who has the power? The teacher does. They ultimately have that power. Use it for good. Use it in such a way that you encourage the student to want to be an independent learner. Encourage the student to want to excel. Okay? And not try to lord it over them. Okay? Therefore, language teaching should be used for meaningful conversation that encourages the growth of the person. Okay? This is all in a persuasive means. And at the same time, we don't want to hurt people. We don't want to lord it over people. We as teachers are servants, in a sense, where we want to serve the needs of our students and not take the power that we have, which we have, and lord it over them. That's not our goal, our responsibility. We want to encourage them to excel. We want to encourage them to believe that learning this is good and helpful. So Freire actually brings some good ideas to the table. All right. Brown talks about a number of different types of learning. We've got signal learning, where you have basically a signal and then it causes you to learn some type of response to it. You've got stimulus response, which is also similar to operant conditioning. You have chaining, where you have a couple stimulus and responses that are chained together, which can cause multiple actions and reactions. We have verbal association, where you associate a sound to a thing or a sound to an action. Multiple discrimination, is where you have a sound, but it can have multiple meanings, or a picture, and it can have multiple meanings, or a word that's used, or it can have multiple meanings, right? Always enjoyed this one. I forget the name of the show. It was a TV show, and some guy walks in and says to, the guy's name was Lester. He says, "Hey, Lester, what's going down?" And Lester starts, sinking because he doesn't understand what it means. It has multiple meanings. Anyway, multiple discrimination. Concept learning, where you're learning a basic concept or an idea. Principle learning, where you're learning a principle or an unspoken type of rule. Problem solving is where you have a difficulty and you want to try to figure out how to solve the equation or solve the problem. So there's different types of learning that we do have. You'll note that this was hierarchical. We began with the simple and we moved higher up to the more difficult things. And you can see this type of progression also with children. And you can jump into, what's his name? Not Pavlov, but I forget the guy's name, who did work with his grandchildren. Name's not coming to me. So anyway, you can look at him to learn more about children and how they're going to be learning. Let's move on. Other types of learning. Transfer, interference, overgeneralization. We have these issues involved when we're dealing with language learning in particular. The transfer of learning is when you carry over an idea from some type of learned response. So you have this idea, if I do X, X is going to work in situation B, maybe it'll work in situation C. I have this language ability in my original language, and I'm trying to transfer that same idea to my native language, and hopefully it'll transfer. Right? You have this idea that'll transfer. Maybe you're dealing with the buttons or switches or communicating methods, and you see that it works in one situation. You try to transfer it over to another situation, and maybe it'll work. That's good. That's a positive carryover. Maybe it doesn't work. Okay, that's a negative category. Now it becomes interference. And so when you see someone who has a double past in a sentence, right? How did he did it, right? Where did he got it? Double negative. Well, that's probably a negative transfer from the original language, whatever that first language is. Okay? Then you've got something called overgeneralizations, where you have this rule and you think you can use this everywhere. You see this with little kids when they starting to learn the ED rule, and they can think you can put it everywhere, right? I walked, I played, I teached. Okay, well, it doesn't work there. It's an overgeneralization. You have a rule, but you overuse it. It's not supposed to be used in all those locations. These are just some ways that learning is modified as you go along. Right? These are just things that are happening in the brain as you're learning. Other elements of learning are the methods that we learn. Do we learn from specific to general or general to specific? Right? We have inductive, from specific examples to a general rule. So that's inductive, from specific examples to a general rule, which would be bottom-up processing. Deductive, from a general rule down to specific examples. That would be top-down processing. Okay, which is better? I'm certain that if we were to be asking you and all the other people who are watching this right now, some of you would say, oh, I'm more inductive. Others would say, I'm more deductive. Okay, a good language learner is going to use both. Actually, a good learner is going to use both. You'll probably have a strength. Right? You may be a better deductive learner. Okay. But you should also learn to do it from the other way. I know that when I'm dealing in a second language that I can use, and I have a question and I don't understand something, I'll begin by say, give me a definition, give me the top, give me the big idea, give me the meaning of this. And then if they can't do that, I'll say, well, okay, give me a synonym of it. I'm trying to spread out. Okay, now give me an example of how it's used in a sentence. Okay, now I'm going down to specifics. Okay, and I'll try to go from both sides so that I can understand. You as a language learner, and hopefully as a language teacher, you want to teach. You want to go from the top down and from the bottom up. Inductive and deductive type of learning styles. Another component that's going to impact language learning is one's language aptitude, or one's ability or knack for learning language. Is there such a thing? My gut will tell me yes, there is. There certainly is no direct correlation between any other component in the brain that we know of. Intelligence is not necessarily linked to language. Age, to be honest, isn't necessarily linked to language, but there's this thing called a language aptitude. You know, what is it exactly? I don't know, and neither do most of the researchers out there. In any event, some characteristics of good language learners. They're risk takers. They're good memorizers. Okay, risk takers I find interesting because there are some cultures that are risk averse. They want to avoid taking risks. But a good language learner is going to go out and try and make mistakes and fall and get up again and try again. They're good memorizers. They're good guessers. They see the context and they say, okay, this, right? They can live with ambiguity. I love it when you're trying to teach a kid something, or when a kid doesn't understand something. You know what they do? They kind of go, they just go on. They ignore it. They forget it. Adults, this is a problem with some adults. They cannot live with ambiguity. They've got to know. And it drives them to not want to learn language. That's what it does. I remember when I first arrived in the country of Japan, and I was trying to learn language. And one of the things I would do is I would go to the local church. And I'd sit down and listen to what the pastor was saying, and I would just sit there and I would, I'm trying to listen. And when I started out, that's all I heard was, psh, just snow. I just couldn't hear anything. And then as I'm listening, all of a sudden, psh, today, psh, and I'm, I got that word. But I would just, I'm just going to listen. I know eventually I'm going to pick this up. I'm going to begin to hear this, the ends of words. I'm going to begin to recognize words and phrases. Okay, I'm going to get it eventually. Don't sweat it. That's living with ambiguity. There's some people who don't have that ability. Pragmatic abilities, people who are trying to do things and make it practical, make it useful to them right away. Interpersonal intelligence, people who can interact well, who can notice the differences that's going on, who can see the interactions between people and use that as a way to learn. Emotional stability. Need I say more? Confidence. The ability to say, I can do this. It doesn't matter how many times you fall down, you're going to get up and you're going to go again. And there are more characteristics of good language learners, but here are just some of them. Intelligence is also one characteristic, different from language aptitude, but intelligence is also can be an indicator of how well someone's going to learn. One's linguistic and logical mathematical abilities, how quickly one can learn. And generally, that's what intelligence, the IQ, is looking at. The ability for you to linguistically and logically, mathematically, how quickly can you learn, understand, comprehend a theory, and then try to apply it. I don't remember when Gardner came out with the multiple intelligences. Basically, Gardner was saying, look, yeah, we have a linguistic, we have a logical mathematical intelligence quotient that we can measure, but there are a lot of things that we can measure as far as an intelligence. Some are going to be better kinesthetic learners, learners who feel and touch and do things. There are going to be people who are better oral learners or oral learners, literally because they hear by learning, or they speak by learning, or they see by learning. And so you've got different ways that you can learn, different concepts that you can learn quickly or not quickly. Things like things that require you to move around, dance, or some hiking, mountain climbing, those types of things, judo, karate. I mean, you can name them. I mean, some people are going to be better at that because they have, quote unquote, those kinesthetic IQ is going to be higher. And so she really opened the door to this whole idea of saying, hey, there are multiple ways that people can learn. You as teachers shouldn't be just doing one way. If some of your students, they're students who learn by seeing, well, maybe you should have more object lessons. Quit doing lectures and just talking about things, right? Instead of just maybe talking, go walk through the process. Or maybe they're going to people, they read it, but they don't learn it as well when they read. They want to actually hear it. And so you might give them tapes so that they can see what's going, hear what's going on. They will learn better that way. Again, all these different types that you have. But intelligence is going to be somehow be connected to one's ability to learn language, but it's certainly not the only factor, and it's not the strongest factor. Based off of the stuff that we just talked about, all of the different methods for learning, all of the different ways in which we learn, all of the strategies that we can use to learn, there were a number of researchers who created some language learning methods. And I want to talk about a couple of them here. One of them is the audiolingual method. Again, this is out of Brown's textbook, Principles for Language Teaching and Learning, and this is out of page 111. He talks about the audiolingual method. The audiolingual method was primarily listen and repeat type of method. It was grounded in linguistic and psychological theory, and it emphasized surface forms and rote memory. Surface forms, the simple grammar of things that we can see, that we study. But it didn't emphasize writing. It didn't emphasize reading. It emphasized listen and repeat, listen and repeat. But some of that is based off of this quote-unquote humanistic style learning that we had seen before, right? The operant conditioning and low affective filter and those types of things. We also have Curran's community language learning, where you have to feel good and trust. Those were the focal points in community language learning. So you weren't going to push students to learn a language, to speak a language, to use it until they felt comfortable with it. Okay, we're not going to push them. There is no grandpa in community language learning, right? It was all whenever you felt ready, you could start using it. Again, what can we learn from this? Well, we want to try to have an appropriate affective filter. And I use the word appropriate here because there are some times where if my affective filter is too low, I ain't going to learn. I want a challenge. So I don't want it too low. I don't want it too high either, because if I have it too high, then I feel overwhelmed and I'm not going to be able to succeed. I need to have it in such a way where I feel engaged, I feel some competition, but not so much so that I get swamped. And that's a gauge. Now, Curran would probably say keep it lower is better. Make sure that everybody feels comfortable with it. And so in some sense, okay, I see that. In another sense, though, I certainly know that there are times where I need to push people because they believe they can't do it. And that's something that I believe, Tuesday here. There are a lot of people out there who believe they can't succeed. And I want to show them that their belief is wrong. They can succeed. So I want to encourage them And that may mean raising that filter, raising the affective filter a little bit in order to give them that push, that competition, to show them they can do more than what they believe. Okay? Anyway, some ideas that came out of all of this humanistic learning would be the audiolinguist method and Curran's method. And that's all I have for this whole area of humanistic style learning. There are some good things that we can get out of this as far as how we learn, especially in the initial stages. We're going to move on from this, and we're going to talk more about other stages and other types of learning and other factors that are involved in second language acquisition. Thanks for stopping by. I'll hope to see you later.